On February 10th, Hogwarts Legacy will release on PlayStation 5, Xbox Series X and S, and PC. Now in today's video, we're going to be focusing on that PC side of things, looking at the PC requirements for Hogwarts Legacy, since they have been officially confirmed, and they have said that these are the final PC requirements lists for Hogwarts Legacy, and that has been confirmed by the developers over on Twitter. Now, I have already done a video going over what you can expect from the performance modes of the game for Hogwarts Legacy on the next generation consoles, and a link to that video can be found right now on the screen, or you can go ahead and find it in the description below as well. So of course, if you're a console player, then that's definitely the video to watch, and I would not watch this one since this is obviously entirely focused on PC, so unless you're interested in seeing what I have to say, then personally I would go and watch that console one since it's going to be more beneficial for you. So when it comes to PC, the game does release on February 7th if you have the deluxe edition, which comes in at £60, and then it does release on February 10th if you have the standard edition, which comes in at £50. Now there are actually certain PC requirements that you're going to want to make sure that you do meet, and we're going to be analysing those in this video. So to do that, let's head over to a screen where we can see these PC requirements. So here we are on the official Hogwarts Legacy website, and these are the final PC requirements for the game that will be releasing obviously on PC on February 10th or February 7th. And as you can see, we've got loads of different circumstances here for PC requirements, and I do think it's nice when we get this. I think it can be a little annoying when we just get a minimum recommended, since they're insanely vague these days, considering the loads of different resolutions you can play on these days. I think it's kind of disappointing that, you know, we sometimes only get that, but we don't get that here, and I'm very, very happy to see that. So we're getting a pretty in-depth PC requirements page, which is always nice to see, and it definitely helps people, you know, when they're deciding whether to purchase the game or not. So first of all, we'll go through the minimum and low specs. So obviously Windows 10, and this is an Intel i5 6th generation or a Ryzen 5 1400, and then you will need 16 gigabytes of RAM, and then a Nvidia GeForce GTX 960 or a RX 470. You'll need DX12 and 85 gigabytes, and this is saying hard drive. Obviously a hard drive, obviously I think that'll be fine on any of these really. I think it's a little, you know, a little dumb really that they put a SSD here, but you know, I can see why. Obviously you're going to be getting insanely fast loading times, but you'll do just fine in my opinion if you are on a hard drive. And obviously this is for 720p 30 frames per second on the low quality settings. Now this is going to be, yeah, you know, that's awful really. That really is pretty awful. 720p 30 frames per second, you know, you're not going to be getting a great experience there, especially if you're playing, you know, on that low resolution on low graphics settings. So it's pretty disappointing, you know, and you're going to need 16 gigabytes of RAM to do that. Obviously it is becoming the standard, so I suppose it's not that surprising, but usually at this point you would see 8 gigabytes of RAM for settings like these. So, you know, straight off the bat we can see it's going to be pretty demanding, and something like a 960, obviously it's not the best card, but it's certainly not the worst out there. So, you know, you're going to need a very, very good card to be able to run this even at 1080p 60 frames per second, which we'll get onto soon. But also we have the game storage here, 85 gigabytes, and that is the same throughout all of these. So yeah, you're going to want to make sure that you have at least 85 gigabytes free for when you do install the game. Now, over here, we do have the recommended or the high specifications for the game. And here, once again, does say Windows 10. This is an 8th generation i7 or a Ryzen 5 3600. Pretty classic CPUs there that are able to handle, you know, most of GPUs these days. And if you're obviously going for a very, very, very high GPU, then you probably wouldn't have that CPU, to be honest. Once again, we do have 16 gigabytes of RAM, which is pretty standard. You know, it's a pretty standard amount of RAM to have for gaming these days. Then we do have a 1080 Ti or an RX 5700 XT or an Intel Arc A770. Now, the 1080 Ti, that's a pretty powerful card, to be honest. Obviously it's getting a bit older now, but that's the equivalent of really like a 2060 or a 2060 Super, so you're looking at a pretty strong card here, and this is for high quality settings at 1080p 60 frames per second. And it does say SSD here, but I think you could get away, to be honest, with using a hard drive. But I do find it pretty insane that you're going to be having to use a 1080 Ti here to be able to get a 60 frames per second, and chances are you won't necessarily get a stable 60 frames per second all the time. Usually the way they test the game, you might, you know, their optimization might be a bit better compared to when it is released publicly on the Steam and Epic Games launchers. So yeah, you know, it's pretty demanding so far. As you can see, a 1080 Ti. Now, so a lot of people these days do tend to have something more powerful than that. If you've got something, I would say like a 3050, a 2060, a 3060, or something like that, or maybe even a 1660 Super, that's, you know, that's a little bit worse, but you should be able to get away with that. Maybe you can turn down the settings a little bit, and you'll be able to get a stable 60 frames per second if using a 1660 or something like that. But obviously a Ryzen 5 3600, I think you can get away with a 2600 or even a 1600, to be honest. If you're using a 1080 Ti, then I don't think the 3600 is entirely necessary. I think you'd be fine with something like a 2600, or even a 1600, to be honest. I think either of those will be absolutely fine. Same with the i7, obviously an 8th generation. That's a lot older, in my opinion. Oh, yeah, it's not in my opinion, it's true. It's a bit older than the Ryzen 5 3600s. That's interesting. So I would say, this sort of proves that you could even go lower with the Ryzen 5. It doesn't have to be the 3rd gen. I think it could be the 2nd or even the 1st gen, to be honest. I would say with the i7, that's a fair assumption. An 8th generation i7 is pretty old, but I could say you'd have an 8th generation i5, and I think you'd also do fine there. But yeah, you're going to need a 1080 Ti or a 5700 XT or an Intel Arc 770, along with this i7 8700 or a Ryzen 5 3600 to be able to hit 60 frames per second at 1080p with the high quality settings. So then we do have the ultra specifications here. Now this is if you want to hit 1440p at 60 FPS with ultra quality settings, and to be honest, I think a lot of people will be over here at that 1080p with the high quality settings. I think, that's still, most people play on 1080p, to be honest. The majority of people play on 1080p, so I think this will be where most people will be looking. But obviously for those of you on 1440p, this is something for you to look at, obviously. So this is going to require a 10th generation i7 or a 5th generation Ryzen 5. Pretty powerful CPUs right there, and it is going to require 32 gigabytes of RAM. That, in my opinion, is a pretty insane number. And then you are going to need a RTX 2080 Ti or an RX 6800 XT. And that is obviously to hit 1440p 60 frames per second on the ultra quality settings. Now it is interesting here, this is using high quality settings and this is using ultra. So maybe if you had something slightly more powerful here, maybe you had, I'm not really sure, maybe like a 2070 and you're on 1080p, then you could definitely, in my opinion, be hitting the ultra quality settings and still hit a stable 60 frames per second if you're on 1080p. But obviously we're looking over at 1440p here, and yeah, a 2080 Ti. Now that's a pretty powerful card. That is the equivalent of a 3070. Now a 3070, that's an insanely powerful card too, to be honest. Now that is for 1440p 60 frames per second at ultra quality settings. Now these CPUs are pretty standard pairings for these. You probably go a little bit lower in generations for both. Maybe you could have a 3rd gen Ryzen 7 and maybe a 9th gen i7 there to be able to, I think you still get pretty similar performance with something like a RX 6800 XT or an RTX 2080 Ti, but I could be slightly wrong there. We'll just have to wait and see when the benchmarks do arrive on February 7th. But either way, if you want to be hitting something like 60 frames per second, maybe you're happy with something closer to 30, then you'll be fine if you have something somewhat similar to this. But if you want to be getting a great experience of 1440p, then you're going to need something like this. Now here we're on to the ultra 4K specifications. To be honest, I don't think there's going to be many people watching this that are going to be bothered about these, since chances are this won't affect you. But either way, it's going to once again require Windows 10, but if you're on Windows 11 then you'll do just fine. And then once again the same CPUs here, which is interesting. The CPUs are the exact same. I suppose, you're getting to a point there where the better the CPU, it's not really going to affect your gaming performance, since as long as your CPU can realistically handle the GPU, then you're not really going to notice an increase in performance in a game like this, at least when it's very graphical, and it's mainly the intensity is mainly focused when it comes to the graphics. It doesn't really matter that much as long as your CPU is decent enough to handle that graphics card. But either way, we have 32 gigabytes of RAM again. I think that's pretty standard. If you're looking at 4K here, I would, it wouldn't go up to 64, not just yet, but 32, yeah, I think that's pretty standard if you're at 4K. And then a 3090 Ti or a 7900 XT as the GPU. Now 3090 Ti should be able to handle it like a champ, really, but to be honest, this is a very new game, so it's hard to know, with these specifications, then, it's looking like the game's going to be pretty demanding, or at least, it's either it's very demanding or the optimization's pretty terrible. I guess it's one of the two, but either way, this is for ultra quality settings on 4K to hit 60 frames per second. Now it is worth noting here, if on any of these you want to hit above 60 frames per second, obviously you're going to need slightly above what they do list here, since obviously it's for card targeting 60 frames per second. Or of course, if you did have these but you want above 60, then for example, let's say you have a 1080 Ti and a Ryzen 5 3600, but you want to be hitting maybe 90 frames per second, then just lower these to low or medium, and then you'll probably be hitting about 90 frames per second, providing you're on 1080p. And the same here applies for 1440p and 4K. Let's say for example you have a 3080 and you're on 4K and you want to be hitting, let's say you want to be hitting 60 FPS, then you're going to want to lower these quality settings a bit. Or of course, you could drop the resolution down to scaling won't look as nice, but you know, it's an option there, and that's certainly an option that you can take. But either way, those are the minimum, the recommended, the ultra, as the ultra 4K PC requirements for the game. Personally, I think they're very, very demanding. However, you know, they're certainly, you know, it's not awful, it's certainly not awful, but it's nice that, you know, they haven't just sort of lowered them a bit to keep people happy, and they've sort of gone all out with these PC requirements, and I think it's nice that they're very in-depth too. But that was a decent analysis over these PC requirements. I'd love to hear your thoughts on this down in the comments, and if you'll be purchasing the game on PC. And like I did mention, I've done a video going over how the game will perform on console, and a link to that video is in the description below if you're interested in checking that out. So if you did enjoy this video, then please be sure to like, subscribe, and hit that notification bell. And yeah, on screen now you can actually see a link to that video where I go over the console info that we have regarding the performance mode. Obviously on next generation consoles we do get performance modes, and I go over all of that in the video, which is right on the screen now, so go and join me over there.